White clots are mysteriously turning up in people's arteries and bodies discovered by physicians and morticians. With the amount of censorship that surrounds the issue of COVID, are we ever likely to get the truth about white clots? Ugh. Hello there, you Awakening Wonders. Thanks for joining us on this voyage to truth and freedom. Remember, click the link in the description, become a supporter of our content and therefore our movement, that we may facilitate stories that you'll only see covered in places where Dr. John Campbell, God love him, or Neil Oliver are at work. And it is in part their conversation about this subject that we're looking at as we further investigate the extraordinary and rather unpleasantly disgusting to discuss phenomena of white clots. You'll have heard about it and seen it possibly online, but it's plainly not being discussed in the manner, degree, and with the veracity and scientific understanding required, because there is so much confusion, obfuscation and censorship around the subject of coronavirus and ancillary issues. Let's have a look at, first of all, a conversation between Dr. John Campbell and the brilliant Neil Oliver so that we can understand what these white clots are. Ugh, I just don't like thinking about it. I don't like thinking about a vein being all clotted up with that stuff. Have you looked at them yet? They're really bloody disgusting. Then we'll look at John Campbell talking to an expert on the subject, and then we'll look at some medical data and medical analysis so that we can understand whether this is something we have to continue to be concerned about and why we're not discussing it more plainly and broadly.
It really is like something out of a low-grade novel, Neil, isn't it? You've got this new, or apparently completely new, pathology being found in dead bodies around the world. And we know that these have been found, these strange, mysterious, long, rubbery white clots have been found in bodies in the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia.
Delicious, Clotslow, lovely, bacon rind, lovely.
Now, I've actually heard about these some time ago, but I didn't realise how abundant they were. And then I was interviewing Major Tom Haviland, who's a data analyst in the States. And he's actually reached out to 269 embalmers with an average of 15 years experience each, embalming about 100 bodies a year on average per person. And in the year 2023, 73% of these embalmers have observed these strange, white, stringy, rubbery clots. Really quite incredible. And if you take into account the embalmers that didn't see any, it was still in 20% of the dead bodies. And it seems to be pretty similar in the United States and in the United Kingdom. These rubbery clots.
I don't like the phrase rubbery clots being said again and again and again, but I suppose even more disgusting than the language and the image is the idea that there are emergent phenomena that aren't being plainly discussed. If you consider the amount of propaganda that surrounded the COVID period, how you were informed of all the potential threats and the images of spores and the propaganda films of people coughing out their last and the hospitals that were erected and the internment camps and the medications and the comms were pretty hot, weren't they, and pretty pervasive. There was nothing you didn't hear about. Don't travel here, don't travel there, don't touch this, don't touch that. And then all of a sudden, like something, as Dr. John observed, quite sci-fi and simultaneously lo-fi and revolting has emerged, and you're not really hearing it discussed to the degree that it perhaps ought, if it is as prevalent as is suggested.
That can be an inch long or can be up to 30 inches long are there and have been pulled out of the arterial systems and the venous systems of dead bodies. And there's some anecdotal reports of them being pulled out of living bodies by surgeons as well. But we know for sure in about 20% of dead bodies. And these didn't occur prior to 2020.
Okay, so that's the introduction. Before we get into Dr. John's conversation with a well-informed expert on the subject, let's read you a little text. In a world gripped by the relentless march of a pandemic, the discovery of white clots in the deceased has ignited a firestorm of controversy, drawing attention from healthcare professionals, conspiracy theorists, and concerned public alike. I'm all of those, except I'm not a healthcare professional. At the heart of this debate lies a critical question. Is there a link between these unusual clots and mRNA COVID-19 vaccines? When Thai neurologist Dr. Thiravat, referencing the insights of English YouTuber and retired nurse educator Campbell, took to Facebook to discuss the presence of white clots in the carotid arteries of the deceased, the online community took notice. Particularly concerning was Thiravat's suggestion that these clots found in individuals with a history of mRNA COVID vaccinations might be connected to sudden deaths. I can't can't see that it would be good to have a 30-inch rubbery white blood clot in your arterial system. I can't imagine that it would be advantageous, and it does seem extraordinary that excess deaths are widely being underreported and mismanaged mathematically by offices of statisticians, that heart disease appears to have significantly risen, that certain types of cancer appear to have risen, that these medications were patented in an unusual way at an unusual time, that the lab leak itself is potentially a result of dual purpose research. There are too many intersecting factors for there now to be an odd H.G. Wells arterial trifid-like story to emerge without it being cause for concern. Despite his advocacy for vaccination, Thiravat's call for further investigation into these clots stirred a blend of support, scepticism and outright fear. What other scepticism is? I don't like when people go, stop looking into these. Perhaps it's my own fault that I haven't seen anyone offer a reasonable explanation. And that's what I think censorship obviously fosters. Like, if you saw someone senior and plausible come out and go, look, you're all talking about these rubbery, disgusting white blood clots. Well, it's perfectly natural to have them. What it is as a result of this. In fact, there have always been rubbery white blood clots, but, you know, there's so little trust, isn't there, these days? So much concern, so much censorship, and also a lack of the kind of discourse that I'm suggesting would be helpful. The debate over the white clots and their potential linkage to COVID-19 vaccines has not unfolded in a vacuum. It reflects broader societal tensions around vaccine safety, efficacy and trust in scientific institutions in the face of conflicting opinions. The call for rigorous, transparent and accessible research has never been louder. The crux of the matter lies in distinguishing between correlation and causation, a task that requires meticulous scientific investigation. Yeah, and the ability to listen to a host of diverse experts. What it doesn't need is scientism and censorship, which is what's been going on for the last 5 years. Amid the fervour, Thiravat's decision to cease public discussions on the topic underscores a challenging reality for those advocating vaccine awareness. His ongoing commitment to vaccine safety, without outright opposition to vaccination, highlighted the nuanced positions individuals may find themselves in when confronting potential public health issues. You could actually take this a lot further than even the issues outlined by this article, that health has become a corrupted industry. That was evident even if you take coronavirus out of it and you look at the opioid crisis that preceded it and the numerous times big pharma companies have settled out of court to repress embarrassing information. If you observe the fact that the FDA is largely funded by pharmaceutical companies and that drugs are often, if not rushed through, then ushered through in order to facilitate profit. When you observe that what would always be a matter for individual choice became a matter of mandate in some instances and compulsion in others, you realise that we've travelled a long way, perhaps without the proper papers to facilitate a journey into the type of trust that was undertaken. In short, I suppose the whole idea of vaccination, even prior to the controversial period that we're now living in, is that they may be good for populations, but when it comes to individuals, you have to ask a question. And when you have a pharmaceutical industry that's incentivized to release products, to have products regulated as lightly as possible, but as regular as conceivable, i.e. the normalization of COVID shots, it's flu season, it's COVID season, take these things all the time, you have an extraordinary culture of mistrust. During the time of the pandemic, they became so sort of zealous about the efficacy of vaccines and the absolute need to take them without question. I think they created this odd climate where people that were sort of skeptical or concerned, like Dr. J. Bhattacharya or this Dr. Thiravat, who are actually not anti-vaxxers at all, that are like doctors, and people like Robert Malone, who I think invented vaccines, they were sort of cast as anti-vaxxers because they were dissenting voices. Now you have this extraordinary climate where people say, oh, actually, I think vaccines are a good thing on the whole for society, and I am a scientist and I'm dedicated to pharmacology and this is the world I live in. However, there may be a corollary between these medications and these odd, disgusting white blood clot things. There's this odd veil of secrecy and inability to openly discuss it, which is the sort of thing that often surrounds, if I may say, corporate crime outside of this context. So you can't claim that we're all supposed to be following the science, and then when scientists happen to be dissenting, right, you're not the sort of scientist, well then what's the argument now? The argument is shut up and listen. And that's what sort of medieval religious power behaved like. There is one true God, shut up, we don't care, we're not interested, we'll burn you, you're a heretic.
All I said to my wife was that piece of halibut was good enough for Jehovah. Blasphemy!
We have had orthodoxies of of condemnation and censure. There have always been that. That's what power does to ensure its power is not challenged. So I think that the discipline of science was exploited during this period, and that's why you can't have clear, open conversations around these subjects. I suppose that when it comes to medical matters, even in the event of it being a contagious condition, it has to remain a matter of personal responsibility. Because otherwise, when you have compelled medications, you're making some extraordinary claims about society. You can't all of a sudden, not now, not in this climate, say, we all have to take these vaccines because we're all in it together. Well, economic inequality, constant war, Gaza, the Ukraine, I mean, it just doesn't make sense in this context. So I suppose, yeah, the idea now that something sort of disgusting and visually evocative, like white rubbery sinew appearing in arteries, and the conversation about it being somewhat censored, dampered down, controlled, not fully illuminated and explored. It's a further indication that indeed we are living in unusual times, where a real reckoning and appraisal of what the role of public health is, what the role of vaccines are, and what our individual freedom ought to look like. As society navigates these turbulent waters, the importance of critical thinking, open dialogue, and reliance on credible sources of information becomes ever more apparent. The quest for truth in this case is not just about white clots or vaccines, it's about how we as a collective address fear, uncertainty, and the hunger for answers in an age of information overload. The resolution to the debate over white clots may just be a piece of a much larger puzzle in understanding and combating the COVID-19 pandemic. That seems like good analysis. Let's have a look at Dr. John Campbell's conversation with Major Tom.
These things are solid, aren't they? They're, if that's the lumen of the blood vessel, then this white stuff is like filling up the whole gap in the middle, isn't it?
Don't be childish.
Yeah, well, we think it's growing, right? So it's at some point it's smaller, right? And blood's still able to flow around. But then at some point it completely blocks off a vessel, or embolism breaks off and goes to a critical juncture, and that's when you get your stroke or heart attack. So, it may be a process where it takes maybe 6 months, maybe 12 or 18 months for these to grow to the size that they become dangerous to a living person.
Really? So they could be growing for some months.
Could be.
I like Dr. John Campbell style, because when he said, they could be growing for some months, because Dr. John Campbell has to be careful of YouTube restrictions. So when he does things like, oh, really? What he means is, so what time were the vaccines administered? 12 to 18 months. He's still doing the maths for us.
We're not sure, but that the data that I've collected seems to indicate that's a possibility. Because some of the embalmers didn't start seeing the white fibrous clots until the middle of 2021, after a certain event happened earlier that year.
Look at everyone in the wonderful world of euphemism tiptoeing their way around guidelines that exist actually precisely to stop this conversation happening. Isn't it unusual? You're living in an unusual time. It's weird, isn't it?
Let's go back a bit. 2020.
Yeah.
There was a lot of people getting the Wuhan version of the SARS coronavirus 2 and then into the alpha. And that's before the vaccine rollout, of course, when this disease was presumably rampant, because there was no vaccination. Were you getting any reports of these white things, whatever we call them, happening in 2020?
I did indeed, John, to a lesser extent. In our first survey, 44 of the embalmers, we got 179 responses from embalmers in our first survey that we did last year. And 44 of those embalmers did see the white fibrous clots. And that makes sense because, like I said, there's a spike protein on the surface of the virus itself. And we believe that spike protein on the virus itself can lead to the formation of these amyloid proteins.
That's interesting because obviously what a lot of people say, no, it's coronavirus that's causing these clots. So it's not the fault of vaccines and therefore science. But then you might think for a few seconds longer about the origins of coronavirus and why it's got that spike protein. And you will be forced to conclude that it emerged from the Wuhan Institute of Virology where they were doing dual purpose research, and you're back to the same culprits.
But then the embalmers saw that explode in 2021. When we had the advent of the rollout of the medical intervention. So many more embalmers saw the phenomenon in 2021. And as we know, there's a rationale for that, right? Because the medical intervention was supposed to stay in your deltoid muscle and produce just enough of the spike protein to elicit an immune response and do that for just a couple of days of a week, and then its job is done. It's got you ready for COVID when it came. But we know now that that's not what happened at all. The medical intervention goes all over your body, turning your whole body into a spike protein factory, and it can do that for months at a time. So the scientists that I've talked to, John, believe that it's exacerbated or supercharged the effect of the formation of these white fibrous clots.
I just have to take a breath, Tom, to pause so I don't get cross. You know, we were told exactly what you said, and it was wrong. These lipid nanoparticles are systemically distributed. They go everywhere. And we're just starting to learn some of the consequences of that. Misinformation, lie, whatever, propaganda, or whatever you want to call it. But we'll stick with... We'll just stick with this. So 2021, 2022... did the amount that we're seeing remain constant 2021, 2022, 2023?
We just checked this year. The percentage of corpses that contain the white fibrous clots went down from an average of about 30% down to 20%.
It's in 2023.
In 2022, it was about 30% of corpses contain these white fibrous clots.
5% of corpses, that's just too many, isn't it? Something that didn't exist at all, now being extraordinarily common, is cause for investigation, the same as excess deaths. And you'll note that the response to excess deaths has been to change the way that deaths are recorded. And I feel like it's difficult not to correlate this information and conclude that something unusual is happening. Even when you see Dr. John Campbell sort of rather articulately describe the disparity between what we were initially told the vaccines, you know, they won't even call them that, will they, anymore, medications, whatever you want to call them, were supposed to do, remain on site and elicit a small manufacture or a response of the creation of spike proteins, but actually no, they distribute throughout the whole body. You know, it all sort of starts to make sense because you've heard it all now, and all of us that don't have the kind of medical understanding that Dr. John does and his partner in this video are beginning to understand through this sort of couple of years of education that really you can't trust what you were told in the first place, and you have to be very aware about what you put into your body and the motives of the people that might want to put it there.
Like
Wow.
I'm showing here.
Yeah.
But in 2023, that went down to 20%. And that's not necessarily a vindication of the medical intervention. Because if you remember, here in America, about 80% of adults over the age of 18 got at least the first two medical interventions way back in 2021. But only about 20% of Americans took the BA4, BA5 bivalent Omicron booster in the fall of 2022. And even less Americans, about 15%, John, took the XBB 1.5 booster that came out last fall of 2023. So as you get further and further away from the medical interventions, you might expect to see less of these white fibrous clots, which is indeed what embalmers said in 2023.
All of these inquiries that are taking place, like, can you imagine, in a sensible world, that would be included in the inquiry, wouldn't it? I remember the first time I heard embalmers are finding weird stuff. It's just like, oh, it sort of sounds too much like a conspiracy theory that you're sort of consulting morticians on anomalies. It sounds just too odd. But now it actually is data sets of during this period there was a huge wave and then it subsided during this period, and avoiding the conclusions that appear to suggest themselves. It feels like a level of obedience that I just can't personally live with anymore.
Basically, I think we've identified a temporal correlation and a quantitative temporal correlation there.
Well, you know, we can't necessarily say correlation's not necessarily causation, John.
No.
People say that a lot lately, don't they? Because it's become a convenient phrase, like whataboutism. You can't say whataboutism, like, you know, what about our invasion of Iraq? If invasions are bad, like when Russia invades Ukraine, how come it was all right for us to keep invading Iraq? You hear your accent, yeah? Shut up.
No.
But you know, I'm seeing an awful lot of correlation here, so I'll just let you know that.
Causation isn't correlation, but he's seeing quite a lot of correlation. I don't know what's causing it, but could it be causation? It's an extraordinary time we're living in, and these hideous, ghouling, gruesome, gory, white blood clot things seem to be a kind of remnant emblem, a souvenir of a rather disgusting time that we've all lived through. An inconvenient piece of detritus that will have to be addressed at some point, probably by us and responsible physicians like those we've just seen communicating, because it's unlikely to crop up in the COVID inquiry in our country, the various inquiries in your country, and throughout the world. It'll be one of those things that's just parceled off into indefinite delay, which is what's happening in the COVID inquiry in our country, specifically with reference to vaccines. vaccines. And I wonder why that might be in an election year, perhaps so that the globalist agenda can continue. But that actually isn't based on scientific data. That's based on what I call common sense. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments and chat? Why don't you click the link in the description if you want to join our movement and get additional content every single week and be part of a movement that cares about challenging, confronting and changing all this. Stay free. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.